The Lost Track of Time, Chapter 15, Part 2. The lights of the tower turned the morning into an unnatural fluorescent day. After a moment, Penelope dared a glance at the city below. The dizzying distance between the ground and her feet was too much. She quickly looked up again just in time to hear a soft swish and see the second hand bearing down on her. Her shock evaporated into fear, and she ducked just before being knocked off the ledge. She realized she would have to move out of the way or duck every 60 seconds to avoid being hit. Sitting down was not an option. The ledge was so narrow there was barely enough room for her feet, let alone her backside. Carefully, Penelope turned her body around so she could look through the dingy glass on the clock face. She could see the clockworkers trending the time machine, carrying on as if nothing had happened. Even from this distance, their movements were hypnotic. Penelope gave her head a shake. "I have to bring about a no time," she reminded herself. "There's no looking back now." When she heard the swish of the approaching second hand, Penelope ducked and let it pass. Something about watching the seconds tick away dislodged a hunch from the edge of her mind. The hunch hovered near her ear, trying to capture her attention. Penelope ignored it. She was too busy trying to figure out what to do. The timekeeper had told her she would have to do something drastic, something dangerous. But what? The hunch started to buzz. Penelope paid it no mind. Buzz, buzz, buzz. "Shoo," said Penelope. She didn't have time for inklings or faint notions. She had to concentrate. The hunch promptly returned. Buzz, buzz, buzz. "Will you hold on a second?" snapped Penelope. "I'm trying to think." Poof! The hunch disappeared. "That's odd. Doesn't a hunch disappear if you listen to it?" thought Penelope. Had she listened to it? She recalled what she'd said to the hunch. "Hold on a second. I'm trying to think. Hold on a second." Penelope realized those were the last words the timekeeper had spoken to her. The words suddenly echoed with a meaning she had never considered. What if the timekeeper meant exactly what he said? There was only one way to find out. Penelope decided to follow her hunch. She looked up at the second hand as it marched toward her. It was quite thick at the base, but it narrowed as it grew longer, so that it was only about 6 inches wide at the tip. Penelope could easily grab a hold of it, but then what? At that moment, a light rain began to peck at her face. Penelope squinted up at the clock to read the time. It was 8:42 a.m. and 5 seconds. She had exactly 25 seconds before the second hand reached her again. The light drizzle turned into rain, and it was accompanied by the not-so-distant sound of thunder. A storm was coming. She would have to act fast. Penelope watched the second hand grow closer. "Here it comes," she told herself. "Here it comes. Here it comes." And then it was upon her. Penelope tried to reach up, but her fear choked every thought from her mind, and instead of grabbing the second hand and holding it still, she lost her nerve and ducked out of the way. There was a sudden boom of thunder, and rain began to pour down the clock tower. Penelope's time was up. The storm had arrived. She watched the second hand as it crept past the 10 mark, the 11 mark, and up to the arch toward the 12. She would have to try and grab it again before she was blown off the ledge completely. Boom! Another clap of thunder shook the sky, and Penelope shook with it. "Hang in there," she told herself. Finally, the second hand was 10 seconds, 9 seconds, 8 seconds away. Penelope braced herself against the brick wall. 7, 6, 5. Time had never moved so slowly. 4, 3, 2. This was it. Penelope reached up and grabbed the second hand, wrapped her arms around it, and hugging it with all her might. For a brief moment, the rain disappeared. The clock was silent, and the second hand stood still. Everything stood still before... Tick! The second hand moved, taking Penelope with it. It moved again. Penelope held on tighter, but every second she held on to disappeared into the next. Tick, tock, tick, tock. Up and up Penelope went until her feet dangled uselessly in the air. The second hand was cold and dangerously wet, and Penelope could feel her fingers sliding off. The ledge was too narrow to stop her fall. Penelope held on as tightly as she could and reached out with her right foot, desperately straining to lodge it onto the tip of the 7. Thankfully, almost miraculously, her foot caught against the top corner of the sharp metal number. Before Penelope could feel relief, the second hand moved up another notch, and she went with it, leaving the 7 below. She craned her neck, looking up. Above her, waiting at the 43 mark, was the minute hand. At that moment, Penelope knew what to do. She would hold on a second and on a minute. Tick, tock, tick, tock. The second hand passed over the minute hand. Then, when the minute hand was at waist level, Penelope raised her legs and wrapped them around its sturdy frame. She locked her ankles and used her position to readjust her grip on the second hand. Tick. The second hand tried to move forward. Nothing happened. Tick. It tried again. Penelope squeezed her eyes shut and, gritting her teeth, pulled down on the second hand as hard as she could. Tick. 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 She peeled one eyelid open and squinted up. It was working. She was holding on a second. Her hand was straining, trying to push its way past 8:43 and 44 seconds. 44. 44. 44. The second hand struggled to move upward. 44. 44. 44. Its gears wound tighter and tighter until, crack! A jagged streak of light danced across the sky and met the spire high above. Blue currents of electricity ran like rivulets down the tower and across the clock face. The burst of lightning blinded Penelope almost immediately. For a split second, before her eyes were overwhelmed with light, she thought she saw, rising up out of the rain, a glittering white mountain. Then everything was the flash of lightning and the crack of shattering glass as the great clock exploded and Penelope flew through the air. If Penelope's world had not turned white, she would have seen the clockworkers inside the tower stand by helplessly as the clock exploded into the sky. She would have heard a furious ringing fill the air as the mechanical arms swung around and around the vast room trying to locate the source of all the trouble. Then the great gears that had served the clock so faithfully ground to a halt, sending a chain reaction through the time machine. Springs popped, gears jammed, valves choked, and pistons flew uselessly up and down. Timepieces, unable to fit into overflowing time slots, poured out of the conveyor belt and out onto the floor. A screech, like the sound of 1,000 braking cars, pierced the air. For a brief moment, time itself was suspended in the sound. It stretched thinner and thinner and thinner until there was a horrible, ear-splitting crack. The time machine shuddered and lay still, steam pouring out of every opening. The 3 remaining clocks came to a halt, once their unstoppable hands hanging in limp defeat. Just then, the most extraordinary thing happened. A swarm of fancies spilled into the clockroom, dancing and diving like butterflies. The clockworkers didn't even notice them. They stood motionless, staring out the gaping hole where the north clock had once been. The fancies surged ahead, streaming out the hole and falling like the rain onto the city below. Stay tuned next time for Chapter 16.